Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name's Richard Howard and I'm Aurora's Global Research Director. In this episode, we'll be looking at the rapid growth of data centers, in part driven by the advent of artificial intelligence, and what this means for power systems and markets. We've all heard that the AI boom is fundamentally changing the way that most of us work, but it's also having a significant impact on energy markets and power grids, as rapid data center deployment places significant additional loads on power grids. In this podcast, I'd like us to focus on four key questions. How much power will data centers need in the future? Where will data center growth be focused? In which markets, which cities? How could this growth be sustainable and be sustained by grids? So to be more specific, how will data centers be powered reliably, affordably, and sustainably? And what needs to happen to make this happen, to bring it all together? These are some of the questions that we've been looking at more and more in Aurora. And this formed the basis of a keynote speech, which I gave at the Aurora Spring Forum recently in London. So I have some perspectives to share. I'm also very fortunate to be joined by Malavika Gode, a senior associate in Aurora's UK advisory practice, who recently managed a multi-client study for Aurora on this topic, which was also released as a public report. Welcome to the podcast, Malavika.
Thanks, Richard. Happy to be here.
I'm going to kick us off with this first question to think about how much power data centers need now and in the future. So let's start to set the scene by looking at the global growth story for data centers and AI, and we can try and quantify this as far as possible. What we've seen already is the demand for data center computing power has been on a rapid growth path for the last few years. And data centers not only used for AI, but many other things: cloud computing, telecoms, media, online gaming, financial services, amongst a host of other use cases. But this trend is now definitely accelerating even faster with the advent of generative AI. And we think that AI use cases in data centers already make up around 20% of total data center usage. And this is increasing really fast as companies are exploring more and more AI functionalities. But to try and get a handle on the scale of this, first, let's sort of try and quantify for listeners. Malavika, could you give us a sense of kind of how much power does a single data center consume? What kind of load are we talking about? What sort of size and scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a single 100 megawatt data center, which is a fairly standard size, but sometimes towards the smaller end, uses the same power as 250,000 households, or maybe 35 large shopping malls, or 250,000 electric vehicles. So a lot of power at a single point on the grid. And this is just a 100 megawatt data center. The largest data center project currently in the UK pipeline is 720 megawatts, the QTS Blackstone data center in Northumberland. And some data centers are much larger still, so they can go up to over a gigawatt.
So we're talking the same power consumption as now millions of households. That's the scale.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely huge when you think, especially that's one point source in one place rather than being a distributed load across a grid.
Yes, and that's one of the key challenges grids face in accommodating this level of load.
Absolutely. And so I sort of mentioned the trend towards AI use cases, and this is something I looked at a little bit in my keynote speech, just around how the power consumption of AI models is growing so very fast. Looking at the data, what we found is just the training compute of each new AI model, it is going up and up, and the training compute doubling roughly every 5 months, which is staggering. So these models are becoming way more sophisticated very, very quickly. And to give another example, that one of the newer models, the XAI Grok 3 model, is thought to be one of the most complex so far in terms of the training compute is estimated that around 300 gigawatt hours of power were used over 4 months. So servers literally sitting there churning away just to train the model at an energy cost in the tens of millions of dollars. The overall cost of training that model, including all the server usage, was likely in the billions of dollars, but it seems like nobody exactly knows. So then what I tried to do in my keynote was think about if that's what's going on for an individual data center or an individual AI model being trained, what are we talking about in terms of total power consumption globally? And we came to a figure of somewhere in the region of 400 to 700 terawatt hours of power consumption in 2024. It seems pretty hard to be precise about that because there's so many different numbers and definitions flying around. But to put that in context, that level of power consumption for all data centers globally, that's equivalent to the total power consumption in a country like France, Germany, Canada, or South Korea. And then there's so many different studies out there looking at how this could go in the future years, with some people saying this might increase 50-60% from now until 2030. Others talking about more like a trebling of power consumption until 2030. I know this is, Malavika, something you looked at in your study as well in a UK context, but what in your mind would be the factors that support a more bullish estimate for data center growth or a more bearish estimate?
So there's so many factors here, but some of the key ones that would support a bullish case would be faster AI adoption, faster digital integration in workplaces, possibly a slowdown in the hardware efficiency gains you've just been describing, or possibly greater AI workloads, especially for AI training. And that is because this is something that would allow data centers more flexibility in where they can locate, because they don't need to be, these kind of data centers don't need to locate near consumers.
Okay, yeah. So there's a sort of a very clear locational consideration that we need to factor in. We'll come to that, and let's unpack that in a minute. So it does seem like, from what you said, there are some huge uncertainties around the scale of growth we can expect in the future in any given country, but also globally in terms of total data center usage and the energy demand from that. Yeah. With the work that we did for the keynote I presented, we sort of came to an Aurora central expectation of around 900 terawatt hours of power consumption in data centers by 2030. So that's versus 400 to 500 terawatt hours now, which means that we're adding nearly 100 terawatt hours of power consumption every year, like a significant number of data centers every year. In fact, that kind of level of power consumption is roughly equivalent to the total power consumption in a medium-sized European country. So we're sort of adding a Finland or a Belgium every year to power grids around the world just to power data centers. That's the sort of additional load we're talking about, which is in some sense a pretty large number. Just to say, let's add a whole country's worth of power consumption in data centers. That is spread around the world, so it's not the only driver of demand growth at the moment. It sits alongside electrification, EVs, all sorts of other things, but it is very, very significant. And I think what makes it particularly challenging for grid operators and utilities providing power to those data centers is that these are really concentrated loads. Like you've explained, Malavika, they're huge loads in one place, and they seem to cluster in very specific locations with many data centers together. So all of that is quite a good segue to move on kind of to our second question, which is to really understand what is the geographical pattern of data center deployment all around the world. Just to set the scene, what we can see looking at the data is there are already some very established data center clusters and many coming through as well. It's well known, Northern Virginia being the number one globally, and in the US, there's actually data centers spread right around the country, but especially in Texas, in California, and a few other locations. In Europe, we have this slightly awkward acronym of FLAP-D, but Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin are the leading locations right now. And in the Asia-Pacific region, quite a number of different locations are already really strong in terms of their data center clusters, notably in China, in Singapore, India, and in Tokyo, Japan. There's quite a number of locations popping up. So it does seem like there's these huge mega clusters emerging or emerged already, and others coming through. For example, Spain in Europe is very much on the rise. But Malavika, could you just give us a sense? So what I've listed out is kind of where the data center operators have gone in the past. What would be your take on what data center operators look for in a location? What are their key criteria?
Yeah, so data center operators look at a number of factors when it comes to siting, and some key factors are fast grid access, firm and reliable grid power, because there's a strong emphasis on reliability when it comes to data centers, proximity to demand centers, cheap power, so the minimizing cost on that front, and then the greenness of power. But what's important to note is not all data center types weight each of these factors equally. For example, data centers servicing real-time applications such as gaming or trading or cloud providers prioritize proximity to users to minimize latency in that data transfer. Hyperscale providers like Google and Amazon value green power, and they're willing to pay a higher price for that green power. But a common priority for all data center types is a quick connection to the grid.
Okay, and when you say a quick connection, what sort of timescales are we talking about? How quickly do they want to be built out?
So the data center development timeline, again, it depends on data center type and size, but about 2 to 3 years. So that's really the sort of timelines they want to be working with. And because it's such a fast growing sector, in order to maintain the momentum in that growth momentum, they need fast grid connections, quick grid connections.
Yeah, and I suppose we can come back to this, but that does seem like a real challenge to actually meet that kind of expectation, given that in many countries grids are already very constrained, and the idea of adding such a large load that quickly just is not. Maybe that's what tech companies want to do, but the utility side, the grid operator side, just we're not typically in a place in the energy industry where those sorts of timescales are possible. Not everywhere, certainly.
No, that's definitely proving to be a big challenge in this industry.
Absolutely. Well, maybe if we talk about, I know your recent study looked at UK in particular. How does the UK look? Like it is a strong location for data centers, but how does it look against those key criteria you explained that data centers are looking for? And within the UK, is there any pattern in terms of the geographical distribution of data centers now?
Yeah, so the UK has definitely been quite successful as a data center hub. It ranks highly in terms of fiber connectivity because it's got direct fiber connections to the US, to mainland Europe, and even to Asia. It's a very established and old data center hub, so that makes it a low-risk location. There's a lot of demand in the UK, mainly in London. There are government policies supporting and even promoting the growth of this industry, especially AI. However, on the negative side, land is expensive and the grid connection wait time, as we've just discussed, is very long, so reportedly up to 10 years. But the government is expected to reform their policy around grid connections quite soon, so hopefully we'll see some improvement in this metric. As for where in the UK we see data centers being set up, it's mainly London. So a majority of existing data centers as well as data centers in the pipeline are in the Greater London area. But because of land and grid connections becoming harder to obtain, data center developers are starting to look outside of London. And if we look at the pipeline of data centers, while a majority of that pipeline is in Greater London, there are some rather large projects planned in secondary hubs like Manchester, Newcastle, and Edinburgh as well.
And are those, you mentioned that the low latency is a key requirement for certain types of data centers.
Yeah.
Are we still able to meet that kind of latency requirement across a broader area within the UK, or is there a need to be very close to London for those use cases?
So this isn't something that data centers are very transparent about. I mean, what that latency threshold is that they need to meet. But from how they've chosen to develop their pipeline and from where we see data centers coming up, we can tell that there's still a very strong preference for London. If you were building a data center that was aimed at, say, AI training, and you didn't need to be that close to the consumer, there's less of an incentive to be close to London. But something to note is that there are a lot of components in the data center information supply chain or pipeline that add to latency. And this last bit of data center to user wiring is one component. So data centers want to bring that latency number down as much as possible. And this is one way of how they can do that.
Yeah, so it sounds like some proximity to London, surrounding area. Maybe we see quite a lot of projects in the rest of England, less so like more remote locations in Scotland, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned the kind of grid delay or the sort of wait time to get new loads on the grid. Would you see that as the main practical challenge to get data center projects built in the UK, or are there other big like physical practical challenges?
So grid wait times and land availability seems to be the major challenge to getting data centers built in the UK. We'll probably talk about this a bit later, but power costs in the UK aren't particularly low either, even when compared to other countries in Europe. So that's another factor that works against the UK. But because it's such an established hub, we haven't really seen a slowdown in data center growth yet. And maybe as other hubs develop, we'll see that.
Yeah. To what extent do you think that higher power cost is a deterrent? I mean, I suppose in my understanding, the energy cost of data centers, if you think of their sort of total cost, including the capex to build the buildings and buy all the servers, if you then look at the energy cost as a component of that total expenditure, it's typically down at the single digits percentage, 5% or so. Do you have a feeling that the data center operators are very price sensitive when it comes to energy, or not?
From the way we're seeing pipelines develop, I would say not, because there's so much incentive for data centers, even within the UK, to move out of London. And yet we don't really see that momentum developing yet. So the cost doesn't seem to be the biggest factor at play.
Yeah, because in a sense, I don't know, the evidence to date shows that data centers are sometimes locating in places that do have quite expensive power. It's not like a kind of race to the bottom of where can I find the cheapest power cost globally.
Exactly, because cost is one factor, but there's also reliability. Yeah. So you can't have cheap power, but risk it being cut off unexpectedly.
Yeah, exactly. I was only more recently made aware of this kind of 5 nines concept of reliability standard of 99.999%, which is well known within the tech industries, but gaining traction in energy circles as well as being like very, very high bar in effect, that these data centers need always on 24/7 power and are willing to pay, it seems, a pretty high premium for that to be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of drifting into my third broad question, which is around how data centers source their power. Could you give a sense, Malavika, of what are the firstly the sort of criteria that the data center operators are looking for in terms of power supply? What are their KPIs in a sense?
So when it comes to power supply, data centers want power that they can get access to quickly. As we've discussed, it needs to be reliable because of this 5 nines concept and their strict reliability requirements. Lower cost options are better, but that's not the main priority. And for some data centers, mainly hyperscalers, your Googles, your Amazons, having green power is also a priority.
So it's kind of quick access, firm, cheap, green is the ordering. That's the way you put it.
Yes.
Yeah. And then with that in mind, what are there could sort of many different options, many different technologies for how data centers could be powered, but what do you see as the most common ways that they're actually doing the power sourcing?
So broadly speaking, power sourcing options for data centers can be divided into grid-based and behind-the-meter supply. The option most data centers use at present is grid-based supply. So they purchase power directly from the grid. And if they want this power to be green, they can also purchase renewable certificates, which in the UK are known as REGOs. In Europe, they're known as guarantees of origin. These cover their volume of power consumption. But this doesn't mean that their consumption is fully emissions-free, because very simplistically put, to cover 100 megawatt hours of demand, you can buy 100 megawatt hours of certificates from a number of solar assets all generating during the day. But at night, you're still buying gas-generated power. So to make your supply even greener, there's another option, which is you enter into 24/7 or time-matched green PPAs, which means that every unit of power consumed can be tied to a unit of low-carbon generation in that same hour. And then lastly, you have off-grid or behind-the-meter supply, where you have a generation asset on site near your data center. This could be a green option, like biogas or biomass or nuclear in some countries, or it could be conventional power from natural gas.
Okay, so there's quite a lot to consider there in terms of sort of different ways that the data center could be powered, but also how those then weigh up against those four criteria that you put down. I suppose let's park the sort of getting access to the grid issue to one side. That's going to apply to quite a few of those options. Well, all except for the BTM option.
Yeah.
But if we think about from a cost perspective and emissions perspective, how do those different options you described weigh up? Like what did you find in your analysis for the recent report?
So what we found is that if you take grid power as your baseload, getting 24/7 or time-matched PPAs comes at a premium to that. Now, what that premium is depends on the country you're in. And the reason for this premium is because, as you can imagine, to make sure that every half hour of the day is covered with a unit of renewable generation, you have to buy quite a lot of PPAs. And this leads to overprocurement. It leads to you having to resell the power that you're not using, and there's risks involved. And so for this reason, anyone that's offering you a product like this is going to charge you a premium to baseload power, a premium to pay as produced PPAs. When we look at the other extreme, which is behind the meter solutions, the benefit from these is that you don't pay a large component of non-wholesale costs. So the component of power, that the power price that you'd pay when you buy power from the grid, that results in significant savings. So even if you're getting behind the meter power using slightly more expensive fuels like biogas, natural gas, biomass, you're saving on that component of power. So this option can be had at a discount to grid power depending on what fuel you use. Natural gas, depending on the country, tends to be the cheapest option. Biomass is a bit more expensive, and then biogas is typically the most expensive option.
Cool. And yeah, and when I looked at this for my keynote presentation a few weeks ago, we started then to also look not only at the UK, but also across country comparison. And I'm finding, I mean, it seemed to indicate that relative to the UK, Spain would be a more cost-effective location, simply because of the abundance of renewable power, not only wind, but also solar. So the ability to put together a complementary portfolio of PPAs that can satisfy more or even potentially all of your power needs in the data center at a pretty reasonable cost. I mean, I think because that's true, Spain seems to be getting a lot of interest from data center operators lately as a sort of emerging hub. There's lots of talk of Madrid and also the Aragon area in Spain becoming a new hub. Amazon and Microsoft are both looking at setting up significant data centers there. So it does seem like Spain could become part of that first tier of countries or locations for data centers in a European context. And it seems to me that's partly driven by the available cheap renewable power. Although since sort of doing that speech and talking to a few operators, the recent blackouts in Iberia have certainly raised quite a few questions about the reliability. And as you said, Malavika, the data center operators sort of covet that reliable access almost beyond everything else. So that's probably at least raised some questions about how to manage such a risk in a Spanish context. Great. So we've kind of explored the various different options. You actually mentioned one option maybe we could dig into slightly more, a kind of hybrid solution. Could you say a bit more about that? What would that look like as a setup?
So a hybrid solution refers to a hybrid or a mix of power from the grid as well as behind the meter. So what this could look like practically is you're able to get access to a smaller grid connection than you require for your full IT capacity. So you source a portion of your power from the grid and a portion from behind the meter sources. Another way of putting together a hybrid arrangement is if your grid connection date is 8 to 10 years away, but you want to start operations in 3 or 4 years, you start with behind the meter supply. You build enough behind the meter supply that allows you to get online sooner. And then once your grid connection is in place, you use some of that behind the meter supply as your backup generation.
Yeah, I've certainly seen quite a few news stories, maybe more examples in the US actually, where some operators are doing exactly what you're saying with gas assets, and to the extent they can build those quickly as the first source of power, and then later adding grid connection when that becomes available, or adding renewables as well. So yeah, that definitely does seem like a way that some operators are trying to manage that problem about power grid access to advance these kind of hybrid solutions. Do you think batteries can also be useful in this context alongside renewables?
So yes, definitely. We did look at some options where data centers add on batteries to their power mix, and that allows them to load shift some of their demand from renewable PPAs, and thus reduces the amount of PPAs that they need to procure. However, batteries do come with their own capex, and there's the question of who's managing or optimizing the battery. Is the data center doing that? Is the PPA supplier doing that? And that's a question that there isn't yet a consensus on.
Yeah, and that seems to get into a more complex model. So at least from an analytical point of view, from Aurora, it might look quite nice in our model to do that. But I do think it pulls the data center operator into just a more complex space where they're having to maybe do more of the optimization and handling of all of the different power sources on site and off site, but getting more involved in that themselves rather than just having a solution provided by someone else, unless that third party also wants to operate the battery on their site. But I think it's something I know people are talking about, but it seems attractive on paper from a cost perspective and greenness perspective. But actually, it seems to me that there could be some kind of barriers to overcome before many people do that and that exact version. Good. So we've sort of talked about many topics here, but the one I wanted to round out on is really the question of what needs to happen on the energy side to enable this vast growth in data centers. We've alluded to this sort of across the whole discussion, but if you look at a market like UK, as you've done in the recent study, Malavika, what needs to happen to sort of make a success of data centers, if I can put it that way, in a UK context? Who are all the different players involved, and what do they need to do if we want to accelerate this faster rather than slower in a UK context?
So I'm going to give you a very high level answer here. And I'm going to say that what needs to happen is there needs to be more strategic coordination across stakeholders in this industry. The key stakeholders here are data centers, networks, and generators. And these three parties need to coordinate in order to get the best outcomes. So I'll give you some examples. If we think of the power system as a whole, there are policies that exist in the UK which promote AI growth, which promote data center growth, like the recent AI growth zones policy. But what we need within these policies is conversation between the policymaker, the power generator, and data centers. For example, to decide on what locations are suitable for data centers and prioritize these locations for the setup of AI growth zones, rather than thinking about, what are some deindustrialized sites in the UK where data centers could come in and make a difference. Because if you set those sites up, but data centers aren't interested in locating there, or there are some constraints around locating there which you haven't considered, then that policy isn't going to be as effective as it could be. At a power system level, there needs to be greater integration of data centers in strategic plans, for example, strategic spatial energy plans. So again, this dialogue between NESO, data centers, generators is needed so that you can manage upcoming data center demand rather than just responding to it, and also incorporate data centers effectively into connection reform so that we can actively accelerate the speed to connection for these data centers. And then lastly, an important point is transparency, data transparency. So data on connection availability is very opaque at present. I would say data coming from data centers or data around their energy consumption is also very opaque at present, but that's probably not going to change. What we can suggest is that NESO and networks should work together to enhance the availability of data around grid access for demand side projects, and that'll help data centers plan better and perhaps show them the benefit of targeting locations outside of London.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, all of those different actors need to come together and have some kind of coordinated plan if we want to make this happen quicker and not hit the brakes.
Exactly.
The UK, in a sense, is in a competitive marketplace here, but we want to attract some of that investment in the UK in data centers, but so do many other countries. Are there any case studies or examples of other countries that are doing this really well to make a conducive environment for data center investment, or conversely, any that have got it wrong and ended up with a bit of a crunch in their grids and made it hard to invest in new data centers?
So that's a great question. I think the second question is easier to answer. There are definitely some countries that did a really good job at attracting data centers, but because there wasn't that coordination among stakeholders, they got too many data centers, much more than the grid could handle, much more than local infrastructure and distribution systems could handle. So an example that we're probably familiar with in Europe is that of Dublin, where data center demand now makes up nearly a quarter of Dublin's power consumption, and data centers are competing with housing estates to get grid connections. So that's also increased public opposition to these projects. And as a result, the governments had to put a moratorium on new grid connections for data centers until 2028. And once that moratorium is lifted, now thinking ahead, they've put in some requirements that data centers will have to meet in order to get a grid connection. One example of this is being able to contribute flexibility to the grid. Conversely, perhaps a case of a market that's thinking ahead for data center build out is the case of Spain, as you discussed earlier. So Spain is in the early stages of a data center build out, and we've seen data center capacity there double over the last 5 years. But what we see there is the government is acting in advance to try and reduce the strain on the grid. The recent blackout is hopefully just an exception to that trend, and we're going to see a more proactive approach in that market. But maybe that's something you want to add on the Spain case as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's all true, and those are good examples at kind of opposite ends of the spectrum. I think as a broader pattern, what definitely seems clear is some of the earlier movers, even leading locations such as Northern Virginia, have almost been a victim of their own success because they've attracted so many data centers, and it seems like the operators prefer to cluster together, which from a data and tech perspective makes total sense, but from an energy perspective is pretty challenging. So given that those locations become a bit more saturated and constrained, then operators are almost necessarily having to look at the next locations to try and find those available grid access points. And that seems to be happening in Europe with the shift, away from Dublin, away from London, and then towards locations like north of England, towards Spain as well. That's definitely going on. Also within the US, some of the second and third tier locations are definitely coming up pretty fast now.
Yeah. And these established hubs, they've been the sandbox. They've been the policy sandbox for what can happen when there's a data center boom in your country or your region. And then it's up to the new hubs to take lessons from those cases and try and make sure that doesn't happen in the future.
Absolutely. Conscious of time, let's just explore one last closing question then. You mentioned, Malavika, kind of some factors that could swing us one way in terms of accelerating or decelerating the data center boom. And you talked about many of the factors that sort of well known about hardware efficiency and various things. Are there any wild cards out there that could really swing us or have a bigger shock, which sends us one way or the other in terms of the data center rollout, either to accelerate or strongly decelerate the rollout?
Yes, definitely. So on the acceleration side, there's been a lot of talk for many years about technology breakthroughs in terms of generation. And if one of these breakthrough technologies actually materialized, for example, SMRs is a more realistic one, but nuclear fusion is a more interesting case. If one of these technologies materialized, that would solve that problem of providing point source generation for data centers and could help them grow a lot faster than we think possible today. On the deceleration side, again, the case of the grid blackout in Spain shows us that the European grid, which has been very, very reliable for years, isn't infallible. In the UK, we haven't really had a major blackout for many years now, but that could happen, and this sort of grid collapse would then call into question how reliable it is putting data centers in these markets. A more interesting idea is perhaps the bursting of this AI bubble. So I'm sure we've heard of this dead internet theory, where AI feeds off of AI content to generate increasingly meaningless intelligence. So maybe a burst of this AI bubble might cause AI data center growth to slow down significantly.
Yeah, I mean, there's potentially a strong financial aspect to all of that as well. But the sums of money being spent in this space are just vast, almost unbelievable at times. And the pace is just so fast. So, and companies have been able to do that, raising lots of money from capital markets to spend on developing and training all these models, building the data centers to fuel them. But it seems less clear to me how all this will be monetized. If you actually think through how much money do you need to make to pay back on all these investments, the payback also needs to be huge. They seem to be all in a race at the moment to be the first mover, to get there and offer the best solutions. And there's periods of time in history where that's played out with quite a lot of volatility. So there will be winners, but there will surely also be losers who spend a lot of capital on these models and also data centers and don't have a way of monetizing. So I don't know. At the moment, that seems to carry on at pace, but at some point, does the money run out? And I'm not sure we can answer that one today, but I think there's a bit of a wild card risk that I see there, that the money could run out at a point where people stop believing in the actual commercial model for these things, and the spending gets pared back. Okay, well, with that slightly gloomy end, it's been fascinating talking to you, Malavika. Could you just point our listeners towards, if they want to read the full public report that you've put out, where can they find that?
So the public report can be found in the press releases section of the new Aurora website. So please check it out.
Brilliant. So yeah, that summarizes a lot of the topics that we've been talking through. It's been great to have you on the podcast, Malavika, to give us the lowdown, a quick summary, but I would encourage, it's a great piece of work, so would encourage listeners to go and check that out on the Aurora website. So we will end there. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Malavika.
Thanks for having me, Richard. It's been a pleasure.
That was Richard Howard, Aurora's Global Research Director, talking to Malavika Gode, a Senior Associate at Aurora's UK Advisory Practice. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow the podcast via whatever platform you use.